Very often, sales planning is unstructured and/or undisciplined, resulting in a lack of alignment across the organization, poor execution, and a failure to reach revenue and profitability goals. Additionally, seismic socioeconomic shifts accelerated by the pandemic and buyer expectations, as well as how and where buyers want to buy, are forcing sellers to adapt or risk losing out. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining Phil, Ann, Robert, and myself today as we discuss the keys to unlocking successful annual sales planning and how a successful aligned sales planning process puts sales organizations on the path to success before the new year even begins. Please feel free to ask questions throughout, as we will be monitoring the chat to try and catch the questions you send our way. And before we get started, I want to take a brief moment to just introduce ourselves. I'm Matt Flug. I'm supporting our small service team, and I'll pass it over to Phil.
Hi, everyone. Phil Harrell. I'm the group director for the sales research group here at Forrester. And prior to coming here 5.5 years ago, I spent 25 years in sales leadership positions at a bunch of high-tech companies in Boston. Excited to have a chance to chat with you about annual sales planning. Robert?
And good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, everyone. Robert Munoz. I am a principal analyst in the sales operations practice, and I'm joined here by my colleague, Ann.
Thanks, Robert. Hi, this is Ann Slough. I'm on the Sales Operations Strategies team with Robert as a principal analyst. And prior to coming to Forrester, I spent about 25 plus years in sales leadership, sales operations, sales enablement, sales culture. So kind of anything sales, I've probably done it in one form or another. So glad to be here.
Great. Thank you all. And so my first question will be for all three of you. Why do you think sales organizations should shift some of their focus from end-of-year quota attainment to a formal annual sales planning process? What benefits may they reap?
I think I'll jump in here. I don't know if you're going to direct the question, but I think one of the main things they have to do, it's not that we want sales organizations or sales leaders to take the focus off of hitting Q4 numbers. Clearly, hitting the annual number is goal number one. What's really important, though, is to not short shrift, essentially, the planning process. So it's really hard, obviously, for sales leaders. They have to balance both help make sure the team executes and getting over that annual number, but also making sure that they do planning right, because that sets them up for success next year. And the failure to plan properly, to start early enough in the planning process, and the failure to do it in an aligned way means that sales leaders really risk setting themselves up for failure in the next fiscal year. That they end up with a number that is one that is unachievable, that they don't have the budget or the resources that are required to help them hit the number, and that they can't rely on other functional groups like marketing and customer success and product to help make sure that they're all aligned in hitting that number. So yes, you've got to focus on hitting that number, but you also have to make sure you do annual sales planning right to ensure that next year is set up for success.
Yeah, I would just add to Phil's comments, and Phil, you said that very well. Clearly, Q4, everyone's going to try to blow out the numbers. That's what we all want to do. But this is the time to really be an active participant in the planning process, to not just be at the recipient end of goals that come down and directives. You want to be able to be a part of that planning process. And during this, as you narrow down whether you start planning 6 months prior or whether it's just in the last quarter, this is really obviously where a lot of those key decisions are made, and the alignment between the other stakeholders, be they your marketing counterparts, be they customer success team, being sure that we're all going to be aligned in how we're going to go after and drive the goals for the business for the new year. So we'll hopefully have a little bit of discussion here on some best practices and approaches, but definitely be a part of the planning in Q4 as you're closing out the year.
Yeah, and I think, Robert and Phil, you both said it well. I think the only thought I would add to that is by having an effective planning process, you begin to create a framework that allows it to be scalable and repeatable year over year. And what I found as a sales leader and sales operations is often we're just in crisis mode. I used to have a client that called it the 13-week death march, right? Like just trying to hit that number every 13 weeks. And I think, while that may be exhilarating for certain salespeople, it's not a good idea long term, and it puts a lot of strain and stress on the organization, always trying to catch up and chase the number. And when Robert and I were talking about this for this call earlier, we talked about really sales planning allows you to eliminate that myopic view of just the number and really think about organizationally across the revenue engine, how planning sets us up for success year over year. I always think about it like an analogy around, you don't just put gas in your car every day to get where you're going. You have to have a plan around maintenance for your car, right? So that your car can get you where you need to go every day. Gas alone isn't enough. There are a lot of things you have to do to keep the maintenance of a car going. And sales planning is like that. It creates the foundation so that day to day, it's less stressful, it's less worrisome, you have more predictability, and you're not constantly chasing that number.
That's a great analogy, Anne. Thank you for that. And Robert touched on it a little bit. He talked about an aligned planning process. So I want to start with Robert on this one. And can you just briefly explain what does an aligned planning process look like and why is it so important? Maybe some best practices.
Yeah, so an aligned planning process is really about increasing your odds of success. At the end of the day, it is about driving more predictability, less risk into your business plans. It's about maximizing potential upside and really about having the ability to identify where and when you need to course correct quickly to get back on plan. So Cirrus Decisions, Forrester, basically in May, we rolled out this notion of a aligned revenue planning process. And this is really leveraging best practices, but looking at this holistically across the various functions of the business that are accountable for the revenue engine. There's essentially 3 phases of an aligned revenue planning process that really enables this kind of maximizing your success and minimizing your risk. The first phase is business alignment. And this is where, corporate strategies, your go-to-market, your route to market, is defined, and this is where the executive team is generally going to be engaged. As a sales leader, you want to be an active stakeholder in this process. So this is where the business alignment serves as input into what are then going to be the functional planning part of the process, which takes us to the second phase of an aligned revenue planning, which is functional interlock. So here is where we have sales, marketing, and customer success that really create their respective functional plans. And we also come together to then define a revenue production plan that essentially defines how the pipeline, the bookings, the goals are going to be achieved across the various functions. That functional interlock is where it all comes together. And then the last phase is execution readiness. And this is where we identify risks. We ensure that we are going to be ready to launch day one. And we take a look at things like budget. Do we have adequate budget, technology? Are we aligned in terms of our tech stack, in terms of the data that we are looking to manage to drive insights, our sales processes, how we're going to measure the business in terms of our KPIs, and how we're going to govern in terms of the cadence and monthly, weekly, quarterly reviews to align the business. So at the end of the day, the aligned revenue planning process really is a best practice approach that guides really who are the stakeholders, what are the actions, what are the inputs, and what are the outputs that are required to maximize that alignment and have a very data-driven approach to maximizing the outcomes.
Great. Thank you, Robert. Phil or Anne, do you want to add anything on an aligned revenue sales planning process?
I don't know that I could add much more than Robert said. I thought that was great. I thought he covered it. So yeah.
I would just add from a sales leader's perspective, I think what has gotten us as sales leaders in trouble, sales executives, is that we end up doing planning in a silo. We do our own planning. We turn it over to marketing. Marketing's doing their own planning. Everybody's doing their own planning. And And really what that means is, in the end of the day, you're not all rowing in the same direction. It means you could end up with a plan for next year where you have a number and you don't have the full support of the other parts of the organization that are required to help sales ultimately get to the number. So this is really about making sure that you're doing the planning in alignment. So you're doing it together with the other functional groups that are important to contribute to helping achieve that revenue number. And I think that's the biggest difference. It's not doing the sales plan and then turning it over to marketing or sharing with marketing after it's done. It's doing planning all together, which ultimately will get everybody on the same page of where are we focusing, what do we need, what are the goals, and how is everybody going to contribute to helping make sure that we all succeed. And it's a very different mindset from what is typically done in many planning processes.
Well, and just quickly to tag on to that, Phil, I think yes. And I think what inhibits that, and we are doing research on this now, is really organizationally, how do we structure organizations such that that planning will occur in an interdependence kind of way? So the reason why it occurs in silos now, right, is because I have my number, marketing has their metrics, customer success has the metrics they're accountable for, and the planning process is so arduous and cumbersome many times. It's all you can do to focus on your metrics and your KPIs. So until organizationally we're interconnected and have interdependent metrics, that's going to be the way things are done. And so as we look into the future and we think about aligned revenue planning, thinking about how do we structure the organization in a way that fosters and facilitates that aligned planning.
Yeah, there's just one last thing I'd add, Matt, before we move on to this very point. It used to be, right, to Phil's point, that a sales leader pretty much, we could say, look, I know my business. I know what we need to do. I'm going to create my plan. I'm not going to bring in all these other stakeholders that then I'm going to have to kind of align with, and it's just going to distract from my mission. I'm going to run with this, right? And then I'll kind of let them know what it is and they can support me. The thing that has changed fundamentally is there is so much information about the buyers that's available right now that enables us to be able to leverage that in really being much more precise in how we go after deals. And so there's a lot of different points of alignment that it really is not about creating more challenge in bringing in the other stakeholders to align, but there is tremendous more upside and there's much less risk because we can align the data points that really say, hey, if we do this, we get 2% lift over here, we get 3% lift over there, 5% lift over there, it adds up. And so we're in a very data-rich view of the digital experience that enables us to use those insights in the planning process. So really, it's upside as opposed to risk.
Awesome. Thank you, team. And I know we got into the data and insights part of this, which is a theme for our research. We do believe that it's going to be that sales is insights driven, and successful sales organizations will need to implement an insights driven sales system to succeed. But I want to dive into that a little bit. How can sales operations and sales executives, how can they use the data and insights in improving the sales planning process? What specifically, how can they apply it? What benefits will they see from using data and insights in the planning process?
Matt, I'll tee this up a little bit here and then open up to the rest of the team. There's two key things that I would tee up. So the notion of data-driven insights, for a long time, many organizations, even that have a lot of data, no one is saying many times that we don't have data. If anything, we have too much data, but we don't have insights. We don't have actionable insights that enable us to guide what it is that we need to do. Insights really kind of fall into two broad categories. One is everything that we do to kind of plan and set up the organization for success based on those insights, all the way from knowing the market, the buyers, and their behavior, to real time when we're now actually working an opportunity. What are the things that we should be doing as we engage a buyer and as we define really what's the next best step that I should be taking to advance that opportunity. So insights really span the spectrum from planning. From a planning lens, I'll just speak to some of the insights. Insights here help us to identify not just the target market, but also enable us to go much more granular in terms of within a specific country, like the US, in a specific segment, let's say enterprise, the specific accounts that really have the highest profile, the highest propensity for us to be able to sell them to. So instead of getting a 20% win rate when we go after these accounts for these specific opportunities, we can get a 30 or 40% win rate, is knowing which are those highest potential accounts for us to target, and then be able to align our sales and our marketing strategy and coverage on those accounts, and have that level of visibility down to the account level, down to the opportunity level. And so that's really meaningful, because that translates to being able to define how we align our sales teams, our hunters, our farmers, our specialist teams, how we create territories, how we define quotas, because we understand what's the potential appropriately. So it really enables us to have everything much more tightly aligned, all the way down to the individual rep, so that the reps have good insight into their accounts, where they need to prioritize, they have a fair number, and they have a clear path to be able to execute successfully. So I'll kind of stop there from a planning lens, but certainly there's others in terms of insights from real time.
Yeah, I would say, just to jump in here, I mean, I think Robert covered it well. I think just to kind of also build on that is to talk about that we released some research earlier this year about the future of sales. And we talked about the 5 Ps, which will define sales in the next 3 to 5 years. One of the Ps that we went into in depth, which we're really excited about, is precise, that the future of sales is precise. And what Robert talked about right there and gave some fantastic examples about are the use of technology, the use of data, the use of insights, the fact that buyers now are engaging digitally in their way they want to engage with organizations, means organizations that can mine that digital exhaust are going to be able to be much more precise in where they focus their energy, where they focus their resources, in reps having much more information to determine whether or not they should spend time on a deal, whether an opportunity is real. And that's very exciting for where sales is today, where there's a lot of wasted energy, a lot of wasted time, reps trying to figure out, is this company really in market? Is this buyer really have a problem that I can solve with? And we feel like through the use of insights, both in the planning process and through how reps engage, that the future of sales is going to be a lot more precise. And so it's taking that data and turning it insights and using that to plan much better, to focus your attention, focus reps' attention. And then during the sales engagements, providing sales with that insight to know where they should spend their time, and managers, where managers should spend their time coaching, how to coach and develop their reps in a better way. So tons of potential, both during the planning process and through the execution phase of using insights to help.
Yeah, and I would say, I'm going to circle back to something that Robert and I were talking about as well around data and insight. So if you think about, for the first piece is, we do have too much data. Nobody has, very few people say, I don't have enough data, but we don't have enough of the right data, right? So it's kind of navigating the quagmire of data and understanding what data is going to help us have effective sales planning. So I think the first step is to really have data integrity. Do we have the right kind of data? Are we collecting the right type of data to make these insights? And is it clean, and is it durable, and does it have integrity? So that could be a whole separate webcast around data. Because, as Robert and I were talking, I said, you could have the best sales plan in the world. It could be amazing. But if people don't believe the numbers and they don't trust the data, then they're not going to execute on it. So I would say, think about the data you're collecting. Is it the right data to enable your sales plan? Does it have integrity and trust within the organization? Do salespeople trust it? Does marketing trust it? Does your sales ops organization trust it? Do leaders embrace it? So start there, and then use that to inform a solid planning process. And then along with the 5 Ps that Phil talked about, we also in sales operations introduced a model at the summit in May around our sales operations vision model. And it really talks about kind of the underpinning being how technology enhanced selling provides these actionable insights. And this is from the data, right? So how does technology enable this? And then how does that enable the sales ecosystem, which is really around sales strategy, process, and execution to drive predictable growth? So you can see that we're all very coordinated within the sales practices, that data is really the underpinning that gives you these actionable insights that allows you to have effective sales planning, or to be an effective sales leader, or effective sales enablement strategies. But it really does all start start with that data bucket.
Great. Thank you, Phil, Robert, and Anne. And so we've talked about the importance of being aligned in sales planning. We've talked about the importance of using insights and data. And with all three of our sales services at Forrester have our planning assumptions coming out tomorrow. And we'll post the links in the chat when they do come out. So I want to ask everyone I want to ask Phil, Robert, and Anne, what changes should sales executive and sales operations leaders be planning for to succeed next year?
Well, one of the big changes, I'll jump on this. I mean, one of the changes that they should be focused on is, for example, and that we talk about in our planning assumptions, is the use of e-commerce. So buyers have changed the way they want to buy, and sales organizations need to adapt to be able to sell the way buyers want to buy. And as I talked about earlier, that means buyers are interested in engaging digitally with organizations. And in some cases, those buyers are eager to have a fully digital experience and a fully self-service experience where they don't want to engage with a human. They can actually make that purchase and do the investigation on their own. Sales leaders need to think about how do they provide that customer experience and that customer journey based on how buyers want to buy. And to look at if there are products that customers and buyers are very comfortable buying self-service, for example, those low consideration, highly transactional products, or for highly repeat purchases, sales leaders need to think about how do I start to adapt the way I've designed my way that I engage with those buyers to maybe provide some humanless or frictionless, seamless experience where someone can buy it without actually talking to a rep. And that would enable reps to be freed up to focus on high consideration purchases that are more complex, where their value add is really valued by customers and buyers. I think that's one key thing that sales leaders need to think about is how do I leverage the use of e-commerce next year, the changes that are coming that buyers are increasingly wanting to do a lot of their investigation on their own. The second one, and again, we outline 5 of them in the sales executive planning assumptions that we'll provide a chat to as Matthew said. But another key one would be thinking about your routes to market and identifying, are there critical routes to market that you're not leveraging that could allow you to earn and retain those customers in a much more profitable way than you are currently. Again, it comes back to understanding, how do your buyers want to buy? What is the purchase path? What's their preferred way of buying? And am I providing that route to market that allows them to buy in the way they want, but allows me as a sales leader to earn that customer in the most profitable way? It could be indirect, for example, pointing indirect at a different target segment than you are today instead of your direct sales team. It could be, like I talked about, using e-commerce, both for indirect or direct. But those are 2 really important things that, from a change perspective, because that buyer is changing, that sales leaders need to think about how they adapt and plan for next year, because those are key changes that are going to continue in the next couple of years.
Yeah, and I'll pick up on what Phil's saying, and then Robert, I'm going to tee you up perfectly, so just sit tight. So I would say the way buyers want to buy, Phil's exactly correct, has been exponentially changed by the pandemic. It was already trending this way for years, about being more digital, more e-commerce, but certainly the pandemic sped up that process. And so what I would have sales operations leaders and sales leaders think about is that buying experience. So if you think about Amazon and Zappos and Uber, these were all disruptor companies that totally changed the way in which consumers bought. They figured out what we wanted before we knew we wanted it that way, right? So they give you propensity to buy based on what you bought last time. You know, Uber totally disrupted the entire transportation taxi industry. Zappos with customer service. So if you think about those 3 buckets and the way the buy, it's all digital. You're not interacting with a human per se. It's all e-commerce and digital. And so think about how that's only going to increase over time. And those expectations that buyers have on that interaction was set by those industries, but they carry those expectations to your business. So regardless of the industry you're in, regardless of how you're currently doing business, your buyers are coming to you with those expectations of quick delivery, great customer service. You know what I want before I know it. These are just some basic tenets around the buying experience. So think about your role and how you're living your organization's brand, be it operations or as a sales leader or in sales organization, how you're making that come to life, because that's the expectation buyers are coming to you with. And then I would say, as far as planning assumptions, from a sales operations perspective, all 5 of ours really focus around being aligned across the revenue engine. And so it could be insights, it could be planning, it could be organization structure, it could be how opportunities move through the B2B revenue waterfall that we introduced as well. And so I hope I've just teed up Robert perfectly. So I'm going to now pass it to him. Oh, Robert, you're on mute.
So 2 things. Actually, I'm gonna comment on 2 things. So one is the first part, just kind of continuing this theme of really what should sales leaders, sales operations leaders be looking at going ahead. I would challenge and I would offer up that you want to be sure that you're building a foundation for your sales teams that is going to be truly insights driven, that is going to help them to better target, to better prioritize, to better have visibility to the buyer's experience, better visibility to the different members of the buying group so that they can execute on that and they can truly understand what's happening. Buyers, as we all know, buyers don't want to be sold to, right? By the time they're speaking with a rep, whether it's a new logo account or existing customer, they've already done a lot of their homework. They already know a lot of what's going on. We need to be ready, and we want to be able to provide that kind of personalized experience and that touch that really is specifically what they need. So I would say, team with your marketing counterparts. Data and insights is leverageable across the top as well as the middle and the bottom of the waterfall in terms of identifying those key resources. So insights is number one, and that drives into the notion of alignment. The second point here in terms of the B2B revenue waterfall that we actually rolled that out. That's the 4th iteration of the waterfall. What is very unique, and I would encourage teams to at least explore if they're able to maximize leveraging their pipeline in the context of the new B2B revenue waterfall. This is essentially a waterfall that acknowledges the shift to buying groups and shifts from a lead-centric to an opportunity-centric view. So think of it as a container that has the entire history from what we typically would have thought of a lead all the way through it being closed. And it also recognizes the notion of target accounts in the waterfall and target opportunity types. So things like an acquisition versus a cross-sell, upsell, retention. Each of those are different opportunity types that we should be selling to. We should have a sales strategy that is unique to those types of opportunities. And that also means that as we traverse the waterfall, each of those opportunity types are going to have different conversion rates and cycle times and so forth. So there's uniqueness, and sometimes we kind of peanut butter spread and just say, look, we just need to sell and sell. And we have an opportunity, we have a blueprint, right? You have an organizing principle for how to structure all the business across the organization in a way that aligns sales and marketing and has that granular level to be able to then inform as sellers where we need to go, who we need to engage, when we need to do that, and what are the best actions to take. So be insights driven. I encourage you to explore the B2B revenue waterfall, and certainly that's something that your marketing counterparts would also be very much at the hip with.
Great, thank you, team. And we did just put a link of our blog explaining the revenue waterfall into the chat, so folks can go and check that out. And we did get a good question that I want to make sure we touch on in the chat. So with all these changes that we're seeing in how buyers buy, where they buy, and how sales leaders and sales operations leaders need to adapt to that, has there been a change in the data that sales leaders and sales operations leaders need to analyze in order to be successful?
Well, I think that the biggest change that I see from a sales executive standpoint is that the data needs to be looked at in a 360-degree way. I mean, what's challenging for a lot of organizations now is that data exists in silos. Just like we talked about with the aligned planning process, where we talked about the need to engage, for sales leaders to engage with marketing and customer success during the beginning of the planning process, not at the end. The same thing holds true for data, that you have sales leaders who have data sitting in data in silos. You have marketing leaders who have data in their silos, and customer success, and so on. And that just fundamentally won't work. If you think about the buyer who is buying, doesn't really care who they interact with or how they get their information. They just want to make sure they get the information they need when they need it immediately to help them take the next step in their buyer's journey to ascertain and to evaluate whether or not the solution is right for them. And in order to understand that, in order to give that experience that Ann touched on earlier, that Netflix-like experience, that Amazon-like experience, where you're able to personalize that interaction with that buyer in the way that makes them feel comfortable that you understand them and to anticipate their needs, you fundamentally have to have data shared, that 360 degree of every interaction type that buyer has had, whether it's engaging with the website, downloading a white paper, engaging with a customer-facing rep, whatever they've done, in order to build that profile and anticipate what they need and understand them at a deep contextual level. You have to have that data shared throughout the systems, and you have to break down those silos. Now, that sounds really easy. It's not easy to break all that down. There's a lot of systems, a lot of data that exists, and I'm sure Robert and Ann can talk about that and help organizations with that. But fundamentally, that is going to be the difference, is being able to show that you have a data to understand your buyer in a 360-degree way, and that you can turn all that data into insights that allow your sales organization, your marketing organization, any customer-facing organization to be able to interact with the buyer in the way that they expect, and in a way that gives them an incredible customer experience.
Yeah, there are so many opportunities and challenges for leveraging the data through different technology solutions that I would add, certainly sometimes add complexity and confusion, make it very difficult for sales leaders and operations leaders to kind of net out what to do. But the reality is that there is a convergence that is happening, to Phil's point about having a 360-degree view of the buyer's experience and all the associated data. The days of having all this information siloed in different places is quickly coming to an end, because we can't manage the buyers, meet the buyer at their experience timely enough. So there are numerous technology solutions, engagement solutions, revenue intelligence solutions that are automating and bringing much of this together to the buyer, from the buyer's experience all the way to whether it's a sales development rep, to whether it's a hunter, a farmer, to each rep provide the information that they need relative to that buyer's experience, and maximize what is the best next action that they should be taking. So don't try to do it alone. Process always precedes technology. But I would say that in today's competitive landscape, those that are able to leverage insights and automate, bring together, right, consolidate, unify that data, and then be able to also add some intelligence, whether it's through AI or ML, that is able to then extract really what we should do, what is actionable, what are the next steps. Those that are able to do that, and there's an entire suite of technology providers that are in this space, certainly part of the research that we support, that can really help to automate and accelerate much of that process and start providing that competitive advantage in the marketplace, because you're in tune with where the buyer is and can meet them right at that point in the right way to maximize that outcome.
Yeah, and Matt, I believe part of the question was, has the types of data changed, or right? So I just want to address that part of the question. So I think what we have now is much more granularity in the data. So I'm going to go back to the B2B revenue waterfall that Robert and I have been talking about. If we talk about acquisition, retention, upsell, and cross-sell, the 4 opportunity types, the data that we get at the top of the waterfall, from the first time that a buyer lands on your website or downloads a white paper or starts interacting with automated conversation technology, and the BANT pieces are starting to be qualified before ever talking to a rep. So we can measure that down to when they landed, what they downloaded, what kind of questions they asked. And then we take all that information and we can pass that to the BDR or the SDR and equip them so that they're armed with some of that information before they even have a first conversation with the prospect. And then further qualifying that to figure out what kind of cadences within the sales process make or most effective. Do I call first? Do I send an email first? Do I reach out and chat? Do I set up a discovery call? So knowing, and Robert touched on this with next best action. So knowing what is the cadence? What does that cadence look like? But also, what are the right actions within the cadence? How many touches? Is it 8? Is it 12? Is it 15 based on this vertical, this persona? So you can start to see, and I haven't even gotten the opportunity to a live person yet and had a discovery call, the granularity of data and the amount of information that we can collect, I think is what's really changed. And so what I would encourage from a metric perspective is really picking, those 3 to 5 key metrics that make the most difference in closing deals and moving opportunities through the waterfall, and not getting consumed in all of the data that you could be measuring and monitoring and looking at, because then it does become overwhelming. But I would say, yes, it has changed, and it's because of the granularity, because technology has enabled us to have these insights and collect data at this kind of micro level.
Matt, I'll just add one last thought here to Ann's comments. Again, specifically to what are the different types of the data. A couple of things that really are worth being sure that everyone is aligned around is, one is we're talking about buyer data, but there's also seller data, activity data, and the whole notion of automatically capturing all that seller data. And why is that important? Well, because we all want to know, what does good look like, right? If I can take a look at my top performers and understand what are the things that they are doing, right? Who are the personas that they're engaging? How are they engaging with them, and so on? Then we can create more of a repeatable process. So one is certainly the actual seller data and being able to automatically capture that, so reps don't have to be spending their time manually entering that in their CRM. The other is, again, the level of detail and all the signals associated with the buyers, not just buyers interacting with us in the organization, but what are buyers doing outside, right, where they're interacting, maybe participating in forums, attending other webinars, other events that give us an indication of what are the things that are relevant and meaningful for them. And so it's bringing this together, but so this is not overwhelming and it's like, what do we do? This is where it's really important to be able to recognize the shift, to be able to translate this down to something that can be very intuitive for the seller, where they are offered up the relevant insights that they need at that point in time. And it's not about digging or looking into dashboards and charts, but having the information that I need at that point in time to maximize the experience for the buyer and conversion of the deal.
Great.
Okay.
So we can go on.
I was going to say, I was going to do a shameless plug for a buyer aligned sales process, Robert, but I'm going to hold myself back. I'm not going to do it.
There you go.
We could go on talking about this stuff forever, but we do want to make sure we leave time for questions at the end. So I do just want to ask one more question of Phil, Robert, and Ann. And Phil had talked about before the importance of setting achievable goals and quotas during the sales planning process. And I just want to dive deeper into that and ask why that is so important.
Well, I mean, clearly it's important because as a sales leader, you're going to be judged based on your ability to hit the number that's set by the company. And I think what hurts a lot of sales leaders is because as we talked about earlier, they don't do enough planning up front. They don't start the process early enough. They don't involve marketing and products. So they don't end up having the support that they require in order to get to that number. But the other thing is they don't arm themselves with data and insights to understand, is the number that's being requested of them from the CEO or from the board as a first pass, is that really realistic? Can that be achieved? And partly that's a negotiation between the CEO and the board and the chief revenue officer or the VP of sales. But it's being able to set realistic numbers and say, this is what our industry is expected to grow at next year. Here's the investments that are happening for our particular segment that we're in. And making sure you have that arm so that when you go and have those conversations, you're building up your plan based on both what your managers and reps think that can be done in terms of bottoms up, but also top down, and having the data to ascertain, okay, is this number achievable? What do we think we actually can accomplish? And using that and arming yourself when you go in and have those conversations with finance and with your CEO to discuss how do we make sure that we set a number which is aggressive, that helps us achieve what we want as a company and satisfies investors and shareholders, which at the end of the day is what it's all about, but not go so far as to promise things that we actually don't think are achievable because they're way outside the band of what is being spent on our technology, our industry next year, or that we don't feel we can get the productivity improvements at the rate we need to get to that number. So it's always a delicate dance. But if you start the year as a sales leader, if you don't arm yourself properly in the sales planning process with the data, if you don't start the planning process early enough, if you don't do it in concert with other functional groups, you're going to probably end up with a number that you start off the year behind the 8 ball, as they say, because you're going to have a number that's too high for you to be able to achieve. And if you do that, it's going to be a very painful and not typically a very fun year for you, especially in a recurring model if you get off to a slow start. So please, sales leaders out there, make sure you work carefully to ensure that you do the planning right, like we've talked about here. Arm yourself with data and make sure you end up with a plan that's achievable for next year.
Phil said that very, very on point. What I would add is be sure that you leverage third-party data, that you have some third-party data that is giving you the level of granularity. It's great to say, hey, the market's going to grow by X% next year. We've assessed, this kind of stalled recovery of the pandemic, and the outlook for the market is, this level of growth. But what you want is to go obviously below that. You want to be able to be sure that we understand, okay, what is it specifically, by country, be it EMEA, APAC, the United States, France, Germany, whatever the country is. You want it at a geo level. You also want to understand within a given segment. Okay, is this in the enterprise space? Is this in the mid-market SMB? Is it across a specific vertical or industry sector? And what about specifically for this product category of offering, right? When we take a generalized approach to say, well, this market is growing by X just at a product level or at a geography level or just at an industry level, we end up with scenarios where we're going to have some teams that will be overachieving. We're going to have some teams that are really going to be challenged because the growth is not necessarily, even across. So be sure you have third-party data that you can leverage to bring it down specifically to the level of leadership and accountability that's going to need to be deployed so that you have all reps, right? As this is broken out at each of those cuts, you ultimately have all reps that are going to be carrying a realistic, achievable number, and everyone's going to be striving to exceed and get to escalators, as opposed to having a view where maybe at a sales leader level you achieve the number, but some folks are going to be way on one end and way on another. You want everyone to be on point, and that way you can maximize being able to overachieve.
Yeah, and I think just to sum up, say, as a sales leader, leverage sales operations, right? Don't be a maverick. Don't be a hero. Use data and insights and the analytics to either validate you can hit the number you're given or go back and say, you're not going to hit it and here's why, and let's renegotiate. So I would say leverage sales operations, the data, the insights. We've talked a lot about on this call why that's important and why sales planning that's insight-driven and data-driven is important. But just fundamentally, as Phil was touching on, why do you want to set achievable goals and quotas? Well, just based on human performance, you're going to have a very demotivated sales team, high attrition, and you're going to be spending a lot of your time trying to replace salespeople if you set them up for failure. And it also then begins to create a culture of failure. And so as we often say, success begets success. When you start winning, it's contagious. And when you're set up for success by going through a prescribed, proven sales planning process with data you can trust, numbers that have integrity, that people believe or they're achievable, but maybe they're just enough of a stretch, you start to create a high-performance sales culture. You start to get high-performing sales talent because people want to be with winners, right? They want to be with successful teams. And you have sales operations really underpin the entire process by providing data and analytics and insights And one of the other things we talk about in sales operations is, I would challenge sales operations teams to think more about some of the skills they don't work on as much, around communication skills, around understanding how to communicate what the data means and the implications and business decisions you can make with that data. And this is where I think sales operations can really play a pivotal role in supporting the sales organization. So not just collecting the data and having analytics and insights, but what are you going to do with them? How are you going to make them actionable? How are you going to share them, support the sales organization? So there's a lot of different components and pieces, obviously, of a sales organization and the sales planning process. But I would say, creating a high performing culture is probably pretty important.
Great. Thank you, Phil, Robert, and Anne. And as we approach 12:45 here on the East Coast, I want to thank everyone for joining us. If you have any further questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or connect with us on LinkedIn to dive into this more. And hopefully this provides a strong foundation for your sales organizations to begin planning to adapt to the massive shifts that we're seeing in the B2B selling landscape as we move into the new year and the future of sales. As mentioned, our 3 sales research services will be publishing their planning assumptions for 2022 tomorrow. And I think we've put a link in there so you can see them when they're published. That should be in the chat, as well as some blogs previewing those. And for non-Forrester clients, you can learn more about the importance of annual sales planning and setting achievable numbers. In Phil's recent blog, want to set an achievable number for 2022? Don't skimp on annual sales planning, as well as in Robert's blog, the 2 pillars of successful annual sales planning. We also post frequently about our upcoming and recent research on LinkedIn and Twitter. So we encourage you to connect with all of us on LinkedIn to connect the conversation and see how we can help you plan for success in the future. Thank you again to our panelists and to the audience. And we hope that you'll be joining us again soon. Bye, everyone.